Every year, thousands of experts evaluate the status of animal, plant, algae, and fungi species around the world. Using a common language of assessment, they categorize each species' risk of extinction on the IUCN Red List. The Red List provides a barometer of life. And every year, the outlook gets worse. More than 31,000 species are currently threatened with extinction. Most because of human action. But human action can also reverse the Red List trend. So conservationists, governments, and communities around the world are joining forces, activating tried and tested IUCN tools in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can win the fight for our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is John Paul Rodriguez. I chair the IUCN Species Survival Commission based here in Caracas in Venezuela, where I'm a professor of ecology and also president of an IUCN member organization, Provida. So it's great to be able to see you all. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that will be introduced by Domitila Raimondo in a second. Others, as they speak today, will introduce themselves as well. So welcome everyone for being here. And we will have a final 15 minutes or so for question and answers. Please use the chat box or the Q&A function to present your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them either in writing or verbally online. So over to you, Domitila. Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I want to introduce myself. I'm Domitila Raimondo. I am the co-chair of the IUCN's National Red List Working Group. We are a group that supports countries to produce national red lists and making sure there's strong linkages between work done at national level and the IUCN Red List. And today you're going to hear from from my fellow co-chair, Neil Cox, and one of our members, Simeon Bazeng, on how to, the actual steps involved in national red listing. But I want to mention that this is part of a series, and you should see that on my screen now that I'm sharing. This is a part of a series of webinars that we are hosting as part of the Reverse the Red initiative. Reverse the Red is really strongly encouraging work at the national level, and having good assessments of the species and their red list statuses is a core part of doing your species conservation work at the national level. So we've done this series, and we're now on the third one. You can see from this slide. The first two, if you've missed them, are available on the Reverse the Red website, and so do recommend that you go and look for them. And there's another two coming up in September and October. So do keep following this trend. We hope that many of you here are based in different countries around the world, interested in species conservation and interested in knowing about national red listing. So I'm not going to say anything further. We just really made this webinar as practical as we could, giving you advice on how to do national red listing. So please do, as we go through, please do post any questions you have in the chat, and we'll come back to the ones. We have a team ready to answer your questions, and we will try to leave time at the end to answer some of those that come through. And then also just to mention that we have actually developed a document on these steps that we'll present today. It's near finalized. It's going through some editing steps by various colleagues. So those of you who are registered for this webinar will get this within the next few weeks sent to you also. So you don't have to scribble millions of notes. There's actually a document that summarizes the steps that we'll talk through today. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues. Welcome Simeon Bazeng and Neil Cox.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. It's indeed a great pleasure to be presenting to you today on a few steps that we've chosen that can help you guide the development of national right list work at the. And I am Simi Bazeng, primarily responsible for developing national right lists across African countries. And I'll be co-presenting with Neil Cox, who is the co-chair of the National Right List Working Group. Next slide, so you can see. So we've identified some steps that are not meant to be prescriptive, but can really help guide the development of national right list work. And I will, like I said, co-present with Neil. Can I have the slides up? Okay, so ideally for us, the first step that we've really identified is to get a good and the most appropriate lead agency, an agency that will be able to coordinate or bring together members to help develop a national right list project. And we think this is really, really key to get this right, especially given that we want an agency that has the mandate to the biodiversity mandate at the national level, and an institution that is really responsible for collecting or mobilizing biodiversity data and making sure that data fits into various policies and decision-making processes at the national level. And we have three options here. The first option really is to ideally have government agency. Government agencies are actually key because they develop or they produce the state of the environment report at the national level, and they also report on biodiversity commitments to various multilateral environmental agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Sustainable Development Goal. In South Africa, for example, we have the South African National Biodiversity Institute that is responsible for, which is a government institution and responsible for developing the National Right List project. We can also have an NGO or a civil society organization, because we know in many countries, NGOs or civil society organizations are responsible for certain aspects of biodiversity, including writing various sections on biodiversity reporting. And the last option, really, we can have a combination of government or NGO agencies that really work together. And this is a very clear example in Kenya, where we have the Wildlife Research and Training Institute working very closely with Nature Kenya and the National Museums of Kenya. The next slide. The second step really is to identify species that we should include in the national right list process. And we have various options. Next, one, we can identify taxonomic groups to assess. We can focus on assessing all species at the national level. We can focus on assessing species in different biogeographic realms. Next slide. We can work on using species that have been assessed already on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species and looking at what is happening to those species at the national level. Again, it is important to look at comprehensively assessed groups. We can really use this to monitor the trends on biodiversity at the national level, or in areas where resources are constrained, we can look at just assessing endemics and near endemic species. Next slide. So we have also developed a set of prioritization depending on the scope of assessment, and I'll explain this in the next few slides. Next. So we heard from Caroline in the previous webinar on how to apply the IUCN guidelines at the national and the regional level. So we have two options. In figure A here is when we want to assess the species globally. For example, if you look at species A and B, here we'll be including the proportion of the species within the country, including that the proportion that extends beyond the country. And in figure B, here we are looking at more national level assessment. In this case, we are including only the proportion of the species that is within the boundaries of the country, including a very good example here, species C, D, and E that are very endemic. They are only found in this country. So the national red list assessment will be contributing to the global assessment as well. And then we have species F. This is a near endemic species that is found within the country, but the population extends to the boundaries of a neighboring country. So we can as well include that in the national red list assessment. Next slide. So like I said, Caroline explained the guideline for the application of the IUCN red list criteria at the regional level. Once we identify the species that we need to include at the national, for national red list assessment, we can apply a filter to say we don't need to include like introduced species or species that have been introduced for conservation purposes, or vagrant species, species that occur occasionally within the boundaries of that country. Next slide. So in this case now, just for those that are joining us in different countries, depending on your country and the resources that you have, we have developed 3 scenarios for you that can be used to prioritize which species to include in your national red list assessment. The first one is if you are in a resource constrained country, we'll suggest that you should utilize species that are already on the IUCN red list of threatened species. There are several value gains for using this kind of prioritization scheme. Again, when you use this species that are found on the IUCN red list of threatened species, it allows for the identification of threatened species and species that need conservation intervention. It also identifies species that may require regulatory protection, like your wildlife economy species. It also helps you to identify species that require conservation plans. As we know, the SSC is primarily responsible for assessing the conservation status of species, but we have the full suite of species conservation cycle, which is to assess species, to plan together with various stakeholders, and then develop conservation actions at the national level to be able to conserve these species. And then again, many donors really use this to prioritize where to invest. So we have a whole lot of donors that want to invest on the conservation of threatened species. So it really allows you to access donor funding. But there are a few disadvantages for this kind of resource constrained countries. Really, this kind of assessments are biased towards vertebrates like the mammals, your birds that have been comprehensively assessed. And then in many instances, the local knowledge of your experts have not been included, as we see for some of the species which have been assessed by experts that are not from the country. Next slide. The second option is really in countries with limited resources, but the capacity is available. We'll really encourage you to augment what is already on the IUCN red list of threatened species with endemic and near endemic species, especially species in species group. We can also augment this with socioeconomically important species, for example, your pollinators, your medicinal plant species. Again, the value gain for this kind of approach is that the benefits are the same as resource constraint, in addition to when you include your endemic and your near endemic species and socioeconomically important species. It allows for spatial prioritization to identify key biodiversity areas, which are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. It also provides spatial data to inform environmental authorization and mainstreaming into development economic sectors that have an impact on biodiversity. And finally, it provides data to support regulation of socioeconomically important traded species. The only disadvantage in this kind of prioritization is that the lack of assessment of comprehensively assessed group means the reporting on the status of biodiversity at the national level can be very challenging. Next slide, please. The last option really here for prioritization is where we have sufficient resources and capacity at the national level. We encourage you to undertake comprehensive assessment of all species within the taxonomic group at repeated intervals, especially within a minimum of 10 years. This is really important to be able to track the overall status of species in your country. The value gain are the same as resource constraint and limited resources, in addition to allow for comparison of the relative threat status of different taxonomic groups to systematically identify taxonomic groups most in need of conservation resources. And finally, it also allows you to produce the Red List Index, which is an indicator required to report on certain multilateral environmental agreements like your Sustainable Development Goal and your CBD. There are really no disadvantages to this. This is like the ideal situation for every country where the resources permit. Next slide, please. So in addition to identifying the lead institution and to identifying the species to be assessed, it is really important to discuss the governance of this, especially to identify taxon leads that needs to be included in the national red list process. And this can be in the form of like bringing different taxonomic experts together to start discussing national red lists and which groups to be included in the national red list process. And based on the groups that have been selected, we need to identify leads, champions in each taxonomic group that will be able to mobilize the resources, the expertise to help support the national red list process. And in many cases, these experts are not members of the IUCN, and in the broad sense of expanding the geographic and the taxonomic coverage of the IUCN, we encourage members to apply to join the IUCN, the relevant IUCN specialist groups. And also we really, there's a new structure within SSC that was accepted by the steering committee, which is called a National Species Specialist Group. We encourage countries to formalize this group, which is a group that brings together the national experts to be able to assess the conservation status of species. And if you want to know more about this, you can contact Edgar Yerina, who is the network coordinator at SSC, to get more information. Next slide. I think, Neil, this is for you.
Thanks, Timmy. Yes, this is Neil Cox. So we're going to talk a bit about resources, how you get the resources for this, how you manage them, how you plan in advance for undertaking a red list assessment process, both at the national level, but also it applies to sort of working more regionally or globally or sub-regionally, sub-nationally, all of those things. So hopefully this will be of value. So the first thing you really need to do is start preparing and get yourself organized for how you're going to do this. And the first thing is to establish a realistic budget. You've got to talk to people about that have experience about setting budgets for this. How much money is it going to cost, do you think? You don't want to be setting a budget for the whole process that's going to be too low, and you'll fail in accomplishing your targets, or too high, and it might you might put off donors. It's a balancing act, but it's good to try to reach out to experienced people on that. The second point I'd like to bring is coordinating team costs. Having a central team, even a small one, is much more effective than just having one or two people doing it occasionally off the side of their desks to sort of that's the best way of describing it, as sort of occasional work projects, not dedicated staff. So try to think about how much the costs of those team will be, and put those into funding proposals. The third point is you should think, are there any sort of options for volunteer to take place in this? And it might be that you can find people from like your universities or other institutes, or even advertise for often junior or early career professionals that are looking to get more experience and might want to help with that process. So think about volunteer options at that. As part of the volunteer options, and also as part of the fundraising, think about the in-kind contributions that can be gained before you start going and asking for resources, for finances, money from other from donors. If you can have a university or somewhere else, or host the workshop, I mean, that's an in-kind investment in the project that you can note as part of your approach to a donor. Also, if, for instance, you might be a government agency where the salaries of the coordinating team can be covered, that's, again, it's in-kind contributions to the work that you'll be able to tell a donor about, and donors like to see in-kind contributions. The fifth thing is think about adding value to the work, what you're trying to propose to do. So what I've put here is conservation planning. It's an unfortunate scenario at the moment that it's quite difficult to get money just for producing data, red list data. Many agencies and donors like to see a connection to from the assessment through the planning to the actual action stage. And it's not that difficult to include conservation planning in there. I'll bring up a slide later that can introduce you to the conservation planning specialist group. It might be worth reaching out to those guys, but actually having a connection to what's going to happen after you undertake the red list process does make it more attractive to donors. It's a good model to follow. The final thing on preparation is try to ensure that you put aside a bit of budget for communications, and that's both nationally, internationally, all of those things. Communications gets overlooked far too much, and you will regret not being able to show off your great product at the end if you don't put aside even a little bit of money for the communications team. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's no, this presentation is not going to give you any magic, sources of funding. We're just going to talk through a bit of some of the donor options here. So one of the first ones is obviously family and corporate foundations. There's quite a lot out there. It's going to involve a web search to find them, the ones that are interested in biodiversity. Approaching them is variable. Some of them really require quite detailed application processes. Others, it's a much easier process. It can be just a single page application. So you're going to have to go out there and do a bit of searching. I'll bring up a website that can help you with that in a moment or two. Obviously, there's options from governments, both local or national and international. It might be that you're a government department, or you can reach out to your local government department to see how they can support undertaking red listing work. Maybe as a part of contribution to international agreements, things like that. And I put down international here because remember, there's lots of governments around the world that do support red listing and biodiversity work internationally. And so places in sort of Western Europe are a good source. There's a lot of sources in North America as well. They're the ones I'm familiar with, but you can looking around for places like that. Regional development banks is one that I've included here with the IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, these regional development banks use a lot of biodiversity data for when they're checking the safeguards of a project that they invest in. So there'll be a regional development bank for your area. Why don't you write to the people and say, look, is this of interest to you? It's all about connecting with people, writing to people, trying to get in touch. So regional development banks, there's one for Africa, there's one for Asia, there's one for South America. Try those as well. Intergovernmental agencies like the Global Environment Fund. Again, connect with these people. They have large amounts of money, and they have a Global Environment Fund focal point for your country. So find out who that focal point is. It's probably online. I must admit, I can't tell you immediately, but you'll be able to find out through your government and see what options there are to connect with the GEF or other intergovernmental agency sort of work schedules, and see if there's an option there to include some red listing and get some funding from the GEF for that. The final one, which I'm actually less familiar with, is high net worth individuals, people that have quite a bit of money. So there are going to be people that are interested in particular countries. There's going to be people that are interested in particular species groups, such as primates, for instance. It's going to be harder to find some of these people, but don't discount them as people that would like to invest in the process. Next slide, please. So this is some things for you to remember when you're going forward with fundraising and trying to raise some money. When you go to a donor, make sure you have a clear objective and an outcome that's going to come from this work. You can't just say, we want to do red listing. People want to know, well, what is that going to achieve? What's the next steps on that? So make sure that you think about that before you actually go and talk to a donor. Don't just say, we want to do it because it's useful. Make sure you tell them why it's useful and how it's going to be used. The second thing, which relates back to that, is communicate with people, talk. And that means you can't just leave things to the last minute. You've got to go and talk to your donor, try to talk to them on the telephone rather than just by email as well. Build up these personal relationships. And if you look like you're going to be falling behind in a project, talk to your donor, make sure that they know this, and they will almost always help you out in some way about this. They're not going to be annoyed with you. They want to help be a successful red listing project. Third one is accounting. Dealing with donors, they need to be able to know where the money's going. You've got to keep all your receipts, all of those things. Make sure you do proper accounting. You can't have money go astray on these things. Deadlines, it seems obvious, but you've got to meet them. And this relates back to communicating with the donor. If you're not going to meet a deadline, let them know well in advance. Don't tell them the day before or something like this, just wishing that you get there. Tell them a long way in advance so that you can manage the situation through adaptive management, obviously. The fifth one obviously speaks to some of these other topics I've talked about, cultivating relationships. If you can build a relationship with a donor agency or a foundation or particular people that work there, there's a greater chance that you can go back to those people in another time if you want to do additional work, if you want to do reassessments of red lists, so you can calculate your red list indices. Things like that. Make sure that you go and try and cultivate the relationships, talk to these people. And the last thing I'd like to say on this is try to ensure that you undertake a due diligence process when you're receiving funding. Now, we know a lot about greenwashing. There's a lot of organizations out there that would like to provide you money just to improve their own image. Make sure that you're being careful about that. Check out who they are, why they're offering money before you accept it. Next slide, please. So this is, I included this slide because this is maybe a website that is not overly familiar to everybody here. It used to be free, they charged a little bit of money, but this is the first place I go to when I'm trying to find funding opportunities. And it provides, in addition to a website to go to, if you can sign up for a newsletter, and I think it's like every 2 weeks, they'll send you an emails with details of new opportunities for you to apply for. So try looking at Terra Viva grants. It has all kinds of government and intergovernmental funding opportunities. It has foundations. It has all kinds of things on there. So try and see what you can. I'm not sure if there is what you might be able to contact them and see if you can get a free subscription, but it's worth having a look. Next slide, please. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Neil. So once the financial resources are in place, I think it is really important to start preparing your species information for the red listing. And essentially this can happen as a single process where if the data is in one data holding institution, we can clean the data. But if the data is scattered across many data holding institutions, it can happen over many workshops or meetings. And in this case, we want to work very closely with all the data holding institutions and experts to understand the state of data readiness. What state is the data curated? How is the data ready for the red list process? And we also want to work very closely with the taxon leads to be able to identify the species list, including both national and international experts. We know, especially in Africa, biodiversity in some countries has been assessed by international experts. We want to bring them all into the process to contribute to the development of the national red list. Next slide. Next. Yeah, so once we have the species list at the country level or at the national level, we need to start sourcing information on the geographic range of the species, the population size, the threats, all this information that can actually fit into the red list assessment process. And this can be gotten from all your data holding institutions at the national level or internationally, wherever the data is archived. Additionally, we need to make use of open data sources like your GBIF. IUCN actually has a memorandum of understanding with GBIF. iNaturally is BirdLassa, LASA, eBird, all these online repositories to be able to complement what we have at the national level. But when we make use of these open sources, we should take extra precaution because some of the data points are erroneous. So we need to make sure they are thoroughly vetted before we can use them in the red list process. Specifically where the data is very old, we need to georeference them using tools like your Google Earth, QGIS or ArcGIS. Next slide. And then finally, we really need to make sure that the data is archived in the right format, especially formats that can easily fit into SIS or GeoCAD that has been developed by Q to be able to use them to calculate parameters of geographic range for species. Next slide. I think Neil does.
Thanks, Simi. So red listing options, right? There's really three main ways that you can undertake your red listing. And we're going to try and talk a little bit and maybe too quickly about the advantages and disadvantages of these here. So the first one is that often comes up is undertaking red list assessments through correspondence, through emails, sometimes through telephone calls, but usually people are thinking about doing things through email. Now this works well or can work well for a small number of species, but trying to do a lot of species, somebody said the slides are not changing. Is that true? No, can we go back one, please? So the main way to do correspondence is you're going to talk to a limited number of people, and it might seem like it's a good cheap option to do it like that. That's fine for a small number of people. Trying to do it with many, many busy people, if you're talking about 25 people, something like that, people are not going to be able to follow the email trails. They're not going to be able to do it quickly enough. It doesn't really work very well. It seems cheap, but you know, it doesn't. It kind of doesn't work very well at all. And the other thing about correspondence is you've got to have somebody in the coordinating team that manages all of this correspondence. So it's staff time again that takes place through that. So just if it's more than a few species, I wouldn't recommend undertaking red list assessments through email or anything like that. The second one is undertaking online workshops and forums. So using Zoom, for instance, for online workshops. So BirdLife International work very well with the forum for undertaking birds, and that seems to work well with them. I've had difficulties trying to organise forums for undertaking reptile and amphibian assessments previously. It sort of suffers a little bit from the same problems of correspondence. You need somebody to manage it constantly. You need somebody to engage people, make sure that they're contributing to the work well. Undertaking online workshops through Zoom is a bit better. because you've got, this is something we didn't used to have. We all work through Zoom now and Microsoft Teams and various other applications. You can organize these as sort of several workshops, maybe several days, but you've got to have the technology in place. You've got to make sure people have the internet connectivity to be able to run cameras, all those kinds of things. So it's useful. You can split up into working groups, but you've got to be aware of the technology on that. The third option is the one that I think is probably the best. It seems the most expensive, but I don't know. I think once you weigh up all of the factors, it may not be. So having in-person workshops, first of all, it brings all your experts together. And that's something that's massively overlooked in undertaking these red list approaches. Having people in person working together, building relationships, learning from one another is just as important as undertaking the red list assessments themselves. It's quick and easy to communicate with one another. You have everybody there. You can do, you see in the bottom left there, you can have a quick overview presentation of how to undertake red listing before you break into working groups. I'd recommend you don't have longer than a 5-day week to undertake. You can undertake several hundred species in that time. We have many, many times before. So if you need to undertake a lot of species, you want to bring people together so that there's quick and rapid agreement. In-person workshops are the way to go. Next slide, please. I mentioned adding value earlier and thinking about adding conservation planning to this. So this is a little bit of an aside from the red listing nationally, but you should really think about trying to undertake what are the next steps. If you've got all these people together in an in-person workshop, you can start doing conservation planning as well. It might be that you add on one day, it might be that you do red list assessments for 3 or 4 days and do 1 or 2 days conservation planning. But to get that in place is really helps, and it's going to be a good thing for connecting with the donor. So you'll see that the address there is of the Conservation Planning Specialist Group of IUCN. I recommend you reach out to them for some thoughts on the assessor plan process, which they've really well developed and we've had great experiences with. Next slide, please. And then really just finishing up, and I want to leave a good bit of time for questions. We've probably missed a few things, but they will be in the document that Tilla mentioned earlier on. Coordinate the final review of your assessments with SSC specialist groups. And that means if you have specialist group members of, for instance, the turtle specialist group or the parrot specialist group or whatever else in your group, in your country, and you've brought them together for the workshop, make sure that they are connected also to what's going on globally. You want to make sure that all of these assessments that you've spent a lot of time on are done very well and can be signed off by IUCN. And then you'll see that the second point here is publication of the assessments. You might want to publish them nationally, which is great, but also if you really want to raise the profile of some of these species, it's I'd really encourage you to get them onto the IUCN red list of threatened species. So that's going to be a case of connecting with the red list office to see how, and the SSC specialist groups to see how that can happen. And that's particularly the case for national endemics, those species that are only found in your country. If you can do that, if you undertake the assessment nationally, those endemics, and I think Simi showed some details about that for South Africa on a previous slide, we can bring those onto the IUCN red list. It expands the scope of the IUCN red list, but importantly, it raises the profile very much of those species from your country. The third point I want to make is, I'm coming back to this communication issue. You've got to communicate your results very well. That could be done nationally. You've got to, through the money that we set aside, if you remember, for the communications team. It can also be done internationally. You can do it through the IUCN red list. You can work with them. If you say you assess 500 species of plant from, let's say, Morocco, then why wouldn't you want to have that promoted through IUCN if possible in the next Red List update when those 500 endemic species come onto the Red List? It's a win. The IUCN Red List is picked up by major newspapers and other online sources all around the world now. So you're going to show the sort of the benefits, the fruits of your labor, as it were, through doing that. The other thing, of course, is make sure that donors know about what you've been doing. Communicate very well to them in a little report, what you've done, put some photos in, people like that. They've got to show their board what they've been spending their money on. So make sure you do that. And if they can see that you're in newspapers around the world, all of this kind of stuff, they're going to really appreciate that. And again, you're cultivating the relationship, you can probably go back to them again. And then the final thing to do is think about the future. We're going to talk in an upcoming presentation about the Red List Index and trying to track changes in species status for national reporting to various international conventions, for instance, but also nationally you can track with that as well. There's for the IUCN Red List, there's a 10-year reassessment sort of deadline. After 10 years, the assessment is flagged as being out of date. I think you should always start thinking about 10 years into the future. It's quite a way. I mean, it's subjective how people think about it, but 10 years is quite a long time, and it gives you plenty of time to plan that, and you can record all the, hopefully, conservation successes that you've had in that 10-year period as well. You've undertaken the Red List, you've undertaken maybe some conservation planning, you know what needs to be done. Maybe in 10 years' time, you can report on a better conservation situation for various species. The last thing I'd say is that I've put down the IUCN Red List questions sort of email address there. This goes directly to the Red List unit in Cambridge. They will be very useful resource for you to find out what's going on red listing around the world. Maybe there's a global process taking place that is already thinking about assessing some species in your region. But also you might want to contact them to talk about how you can get species onto the Red List. You might want to contact them to find out what kind of database you can use that's compatible with the IUCN Red List. One word of caution though is these guys are really busy and there's very few of them. There's not a huge team like some people think. So don't be discouraged if you don't hear back straight away from them, okay? The other thing I would say is that I don't have it here, but the SSC team, there's quite a few people here, can probably provide you with an email address for you to reach out to, and if there's particular specialist groups that they can connect you to, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to do that. And I think, thanks to everybody, on behalf of me and Simi, that's us. It's been great presenting to you, and I'm hoping, yeah, we've got another 17 minutes or so question time, so we're happy to answer whatever you like. Thanks again, everyone.
Hello, well, thank you so much, Neil and Bazan. Full of practical advice. It's a really great presentation because it goes to the details of how to do this. Great, well done. I see a few questions in the chat, and I see Domitila already has selected Katarina's question about SIS at the national level. So maybe Domitila, over to you, and perhaps you could pick up a couple of the questions in the chat as well. I think that you probably could do that as well. Over to you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and please do keep bringing the questions into the chat. Now that you've heard our entire presentation, please put in more questions. So the first question is asking us, is there a database for doing national red listing as the IUCN Red List has the species information system? And I'm going to answer that question to say that there isn't one standard database, online database or data portal that provides a system for countries to do national red listing into. It just, at this stage, it's up to each country to develop their own data management system. But if you are resource constrained or resource limited, the two first options that we gave, that Simi presented to you, we do recommend that you contact the IUCN Red List and ask them if they will set up a working set for you to work in IUCN SIS, in the SIS system. They do allow national red listing to be done in that system. However, national red lists are not published on the IUCN Red List, only global assessments are. So if it's just a proportion of the population for your country and not the entire global range, then that assessment can be done in SIS, and you can produce a PDF from that and a Word document from that, but you can't publish it onto the IUCN Red List. You would have to publish that nationally. But it is very possible to even export that into really nice Excel files that could be imported into another web-based system for you nationally. So recommend that you do consider that. If your species are national endemics or near endemics, as we suggested you do the entire population for those species, then it will be published on the IUCN Red List. So that recommendation we said for resource limited countries, please add to what's on the IUCN Red List by bringing all your endemics and near endemics and do them as global assessments, publish them on the IUCN Red List. That way you don't have to pay for producing your own database system, and it will be published in a place that's really, really got a huge amount of following and profile, as Neil mentioned. So that's really a first step. If you're a country that hasn't done national red listing, do your endemics and near endemics, publish them on the IUCN Red List. If you've got the resources to do full taxonomic groups, then produce your own data system that's compatible with the IUCN. And maybe, Neil, you want to talk about SIS Connect. Would you like to add to what I've said?
So I don't know so much about SIS Connect, Tiller, but what I would say is, and I see Caroline from the Red List unit is in the text as well. I would say that if you are thinking about a project, reach out to the Red List unit to see what options there are for SIS Connect, which is a way of having a database that is compatible with the Species Information Service, the SIS database. So if you have...
Let me explain that, and maybe Tim or one of the other team members could put the SIS Connect into the chat, please. So SIS Connect is a place where you can transfer data from your own national database and submit and link it to the IUCN Red List. And likewise, you can also download what has been published on the IUCN Red List in a very usable format through SIS Connect. So it's a online platform that allows the communication of national and assessments done at the national level to the IUCN Red List. It's very useful. Also, if you're designing your database for national red listing, it's worth looking at how the data is required for the IUCN Red List by looking at the different CSV template folders in that on SIS Connect. So just to summarize, you can do assessments using SIS system. You need to ask permission. You can do national assessments. You need to ask permission for the Red List unit. They have very limited capacity, but they will help you if you're very clear about which species you need to do. And then, as I said, endemics and near endemics, absolutely send them through to the SIS system. Over time, if we see a big enough demand for many countries who are asking us to produce a national system for assessing, we could look at that. And at this stage, most countries have been happy to develop their own system. So we haven't yet developed that.
So one thing, Tiller, I think, and maybe I overlooked in talking about this, is that when you reach out at an early stage to the Red List unit with the email address that I gave, because not only can they help talk about these database issues, but there might be training opportunities as well for you in country. So go talking to them and discuss what your project wants to be and all the technological sort of advice they can give there.
Yeah. Also, Tiller, just to make sure that when you use the taxonomy at the national level, should be compatible with what is used by the IUCN, because the IUCN will not use a different taxonomy. So there's a guideline on what taxonomy is used for which particular taxonomy group. So just always make sure you consult that as well.
Okay, I'd then like to take the question from Eleanor Kritzberg on What about assessments of invertebrates, which require engagement of experts in the specific group and regions? I assume the assessments of such groups should be carried out in links in their habitat and ecosystems, and especially for endemic species, and assessments of threats for habitats. Do you have any case studies or best practice to share? So, Neil, would you like to answer that question?
I'm not. Yeah, I can have a go. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but for invertebrates, there's, you know, we know a lot less about some invertebrate species than others, but I think the assessment process as it is, how you start gathering information on the distribution, the population, the habitats and ecology, the threats, the use of the species and the conservation measures it runs pretty much the same as for vertebrate species as well. What I would think with invertebrates is that you're probably going to have to look at some things such as available habitat as well, rather than just rely on trying to figure out populations. So all of the SIS system can still be used for invertebrates as it can for vertebrates and that. I think and we're really encouraging an uptake of more invertebrates, more plants, more fungi onto the IUCN Red List. It's recognised that the Red List at the moment is mostly vertebrate based. Not all vertebrates have been assessed, but the reason for that is that it's been a long slog to get all the vertebrates on there. We need the invertebrates and everything else to be able to report more precisely and more broadly on biodiversity writ large as well, I would say. So I don't think I'm not sure if I fully answered the question there, Tilla. But
yeah, I can. So the question, thanks, Neil. I think that does answer quite a few aspects. The question is, you know, how easy is those invertebrate assessments to do at the global level? Shouldn't you focus in on their habitats and their areas? So if I understand that question, I think it's very important to understand that assessments for invertebrates and plants and fungi and other what we call speciose groups, where there are a lot of species and few experts, those are best done at the national level, because often they just aren't. If you try to assess all bees for the world, there isn't a small enough. There are too many species for a global group to do it, and those global experts would not be able to have knowledge of all the places where those species occur. So that's why doing assessments of those speciose groups, plants, invertebrates, fungi, etc., are best done at the national level. And so organize your experts nationally to do those invertebrate assessments, and then you will also have the best knowledge on habitat. There are global experts that can help you to know how to do it and which way to do it and what kinds of data to use. As Neil was suggesting, you do need to have a good understanding of that. Okay, thank you. And then there was another question around can assessments be done for by one or two assessors nationally? And if you're doing a national assessment, you can have one or two core staff members, as Neil mentioned, a core coordination team. But it is much better for national assessment. You shouldn't just submit those assessments. You really do have to get the buy-in of colleagues and experts from your country. And so setting up a broader group with, as Simeon Bazeng explained, with taxon leads and a group of taxon experts for each group, having those groups of experts set up and making sure that they check all your assessments, that's very critical. So we don't recommend only one or two people do the assessments alone. They can be the full-time staff members doing the work, but they have to coordinate with teams of experts.
I think just to add to that, Tilla, there's a lot of poorly known species where there might be only one expert that knows that species. And in that case, you know, you go ahead and start working on the species, and it might be some sort of rare fungi, for instance, but try to coordinate with the SSC, the Species Survival Commission, as well, so that those guys can look over it and help you with that as well. But connecting with as many people in country, and there will be some experts sometimes outside of the country, try to do that as much as you can. Just going off on a little bit, but one of the real advantages of bringing people together is that you bring experienced sort of older researchers, people that are working in museums and things like that, and connect them with younger field workers. And, you know, sharing knowledge like that, I can't overemphasize the benefits of that as much as, you know, just as much as doing the red listing work itself. So sorry to hijack that question, but yeah.
Thanks. Okay, then now that's a really important point, Neil. And there's a question, what is the best, from Paula Morales, what is the best or recommended way to reach taxonomists to get involved and interested to review species distributions of red list assessments in a megadiverse country? Simi, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I don't think there's a straightforward question. Like, you know, the SSC is really, the work of the SSC is done on a volunteer basis. So if you know experts at a national level or internationally, it is worth linking up with them. But most especially those that are within or formalized SSC specialist group, because they understand the mandate of those assessments and they understand the importance of those assessments. It is always good to link up either with the chair, and the chair can perhaps recommend members in the region that can help support the reviewing of those assessments. I don't know if there are other options, but yeah, the SSC is a good place to go.
I think also just, you know, Simi made a really good point about volunteers. They're volunteering experts, and another reason I have to advocate again for in-person workshops is that it's a real benefit for people to come together. Some of those experts, they get you know, they get something out of contributing to the volunteering process, aside from seeing that their species are having their conservation profile raised overall for conservation actions. But bringing people together, yeah, it's what people like to see, and that's why they will contribute to your project.
So thanks, Neil. Then there's a question asking about key forest cover data that can be used to assess current and historical forest loss. And that there are good data sets, global data sets tracking forest cover loss, and this is very good for forest specific species to use. You can try Global Forest Watch actually allows you to calculate for a particular area polygon the rate of the forest loss. So you can put the polygon for the species in, and then it works out which proportion has been lost. And then I think we are running short on time, so this is the last question to answer from Joshua Weber. If the global assessments for widely distributed species are out of date, and you need to update nationally, is it better to wait for those assessments to be completed, or should the national assessment continue? Or if you're managing both processes, to prioritize global assessments first, even if the workflow may not be ideal in terms of the logistics. So I think that I'm trying to understand that question. And Joshua, I think that if you're responsible for that, for producing the data that will go into the global assessments, then it's fine to publish the national assessments before the global assessment. But if there's a global assessment being done by a different group, it's really, really important that you coordinate between those two processes. As Neil Cox mentioned in his presentation, as you start working on a taxonomic group at the national level, find out if there's a global process going on, and then coordinate that the data are shared. So if any work's already been done at the global level, you can use it at the national level, even if it's still in draft format. And if they haven't started your assessments, then you can produce the drafts and send them into the global process. So that coordination is quite critical. I mean, it's quite easily done through the IUCN. The Red List unit will let you know if there's a global process and give you the contact details of who the people are leading that.
Thank you so much. I think we're reaching the end of the time that we have for today. There's just about 1 minute left. As I just included in the chat, if there are any questions that we were not able to answer, we will share them with the panelists. I'm sure that Neil, Bizeng, and Domitila will be able to respond to them later on directly. So thank you to the three of you. Really fantastic, super useful presentation. It's great to see advice from all of you guys who've been involved so much in this topic. As you all know, national red lists to me are the core of the use of red lists because they lead much more directly to conservation action, often, not always the case, but look forward to seeing this movement grow and expand over time with wonderful people like you behind the helm. So thank you so much. Great to see you all. Well, thanks to all the participants. We had about 150 at some point, so that's a really good audience. And as we mentioned in the chat, this will be is being recorded. It will be available on our website as along the other webinars on the topic as well. So thank you so much. Great to see you. Until next time.